Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome you to the first session of the webinar series on Planning for Healthy Economy in Sri Lanka. In today's session, we are going to focus on economic policy landscape in favor of economic recovery efforts in Sri Lanka. We hope that today's session will inspire many new ideas and discussion on how we can think out of the box and plan our cities in order to bring the best contribution to the national economy of Sri Lanka. Before starting the session, let me remind you the ground rules that you will have to follow throughout the session. Make sure your name and the membership number are set up correctly during your participation in the session. This session is considered as one of the continuous professional development program of ITPSL for this year. However, please note that you need to attend the session at least 80% of the total time in order to be counted as successful participant of the CPD event. Most importantly, make sure you are muted and that your video is switched off during the webinar session. During the Q&A session, you can use the raise hand option, or else you can ask the question also by forwarding question to the chat room. The economy is dynamics and shifts are not going to go up all the time. So we have to learn how to manage decline too. So with the thought of Jennifer Clark, now I coordinately invite Planner Devshriyani Jayasundara, Madam, President of Institute of Town Planners, Sri Lanka, to deliver the welcome speech.
Thank you, Satya. Good morning, everybody, and Ivan, our past presidents, fellow members, council members, and members of the Institute of Town Planners, distinguished guests. Being the president of the ITPSL, I am delighted to make this speech on the occasion of the first continuous professional program organized for the term 2022-2023 by the CURP of the Institute under the theme Economic Policy Landscape in Favor of Economic Recovery Efforts. All the nations, whether developed or developing, have been undergoing serious hardships for the past 2 years due to the corona pandemic. Such hardships have multiplied due to the Russian-Ukraine war. The current global news provide a worrying indication of another global economic crisis. Sri Lanka's situation, as we all witness today, is serious. We are in economic turmoil, which has led to political and social crises. There are various views put forward by professionals regarding our crisis. However, the single reason is we have not managed our economy professionally with a long-term perspective. When our motherland is in distress, being professionals, it is our duty to work with all the other professionals and stakeholders to overcome difficulties. By this time, we, the ITPSL, have already submitted our proposals to the policymakers for establishing social and political stability as an urgent requirement, and a proposal regarding the establishment of the National Planning Commission under the Constitution of Sri Lanka, the proposed 21st Amendment, for rational use of resources for economic development. We are also working on long-term proposals for submission to policymakers. It is with this perspective that the Institute of Town Planners Sri Lanka set its 40th anniversary theme as Facing the Future with Confidence. Today's webinar is aimed at providing the ITPSL members with in-depth insight into the present crisis and potential directions for recovery. The ITPSL is privileged to have two eminent resource persons, Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara, Political Economist, UNDP, and Mr. Dhananath Fernando, CEO ADVOCATA, to share their wealth of knowledge and experiences with us today. I wish that the members of the ITPSL will benefit from the proceedings of today's webinar to widen their knowledge of the crisis so that their contribution to formulating long-term proposals for the recovery will be reinforced. Let me record my appreciation to Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara and Mr. Dhananath Fernando for accepting our invitation on short notice. I would like to take this opportunity to record my appreciation to all the members of the CURP who performed a remarkable role to make this CPD a great success. I appreciate Planner Dr. Upuli Pereira, Chairman CURP, Planner Madhuka Tamarasi, convener, and the team for their genuine commitment and giving me the strength and confidence to effectively perform my duties as the president. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Madam. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm profoundly delighted to take this opportunity to introduce our two amazing guest speakers, Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara and Mr. Dhananath Fernando. Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara is a political economist and policy analysis and a researcher with over 15 years and she has received her PhD from Purdue University in USA. Her research specialized in design, implementation, uptake, and direction of research on a range of topics, including service delivery, labor relations, livelihood, and geopoliticals. And not only Sri Lanka, she has carried out her research in United States, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uganda, and Kenya. She is currently the economist at UNDP, Sri Lanka. Mr. Dhananath Fernando. Mr. Dhananath Fernando is a Chief Operating Officer of ADVOCATA, an economic policy think tank of Sri Lanka, and where he is a founder member. He was the winner of the Asian Think Tank Shark Tank competition in 2018 and a finalist for the Think Tank Shark Tank Global competition in New York in 2019. And also, Mr. Dhananath is a volunteer, also founding member of several voluntary organizations. This session host is none other than planner Dr. Upuli Pereira. Dr. Upuli is currently the head of the department and senior lecturer of Department of State Management and Valuation in University of Sri Jagadhanapura. And also, she is the director of Center for the Urban and Regional Planning. So without taking any more time, I would now like to hand over the session to Dr. Upuli Pereira. Madam, over to you.
Right. Thank you very much, Satya, for this introduction. Right. So once again, I welcome all the participants to this CPD webinar organized by the Center of Urban and Regional Planning of ITPSL. And today we are going to discuss a very important topic as well as an indispensable topic, economic policy landscape in favor of economic recovery efforts in Sri Lanka. I do not believe that I should take time to set a background to this problem because we all experience the kind of symptoms of these issues every day, and those shapes are well articulated at so many levels. However, I must note that we often take this problem sometimes as a standalone problem in Sri Lanka itself. But sometimes we were wondering whether we are missing the larger picture to this as well. I believe these are also repercussions of we've been, as a society, we've been financially, socially, and politically addicted to this unending growth. And we always after this exponential GDP, and we were in a set of mass consumerism promoted by the economists in the 20th century who haven't even seen this new form of pressures in the 21st century. So there is a question to what extent we can think that those theories would be up for taking the challenges today. And as the first generation, including the planners of the 21st century, who we are the one who experiencing these issues today, and we need to develop ideas that suits to present context, including planning. So it is with this standpoint, actually, we set out the theme today, as well as the outcome of today's session, that we as planners to kind of self-reflect on how the planning that we engage in from different sectors, scales, and levels be supportive of the economic recovery process in Sri Lanka, more particularly, and also to align with this economic reengineering that happens across the world, where the world economies and cities are now actually overhauling to be thriving and regenerative and distributive likewise. So in that note, today we will be taking the webinar through primarily 3 sectors. First, about giving an overview to the economic crisis in Sri Lanka and sustainable debt restructuring. And then we will discuss about the windows for new investment, as well as new value drivers that can be created through innovative and sustainable financing. And then what demands as project priorities and monitoring of the process outcomes, particularly referring to development projects. So after this discussion, 2 rounds of discussion with the resource persons, then I will open the floor for Q&A, and we can proceed likewise. So first of all, I would like to invite Mr. Dhananath Fernando, the Chief Operating Officer of ADVOCATA, to first present us an overview of the economic crisis in Sri Lanka and sustainable debt restructuring. Thank you very much. And Mr. Dhananath, the session is over to you.
Thank you, Pranupali, and welcome and good morning to all of you. I'm very honored to share my thoughts today, and thank you very much for the invitation again. So I'll quickly provide a quick overview of the current situation and provide sort of a framework to understand, in my view, how should we think about it. So currently what we are experiencing is the balance of payment crisis, and this sort of economic crisis comes in a package of 5. So what we experience as long fuel queues or shortages on some other essentials are basically in economic terms called the balance of payment crisis. In otherwise shortages.
Mr. Dhananath, sorry to disturb you. I don't know. I don't see your video on. Is that the case?
I can see it's on.
Yeah,
others,
we can see.
It is
Right,
on.
okay.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry. Then maybe.
all right. So on the so what we experience is basically the balance of payment crisis or the shortages of dollars, and that's why the long queues and all that. That's crisis number 1. And generally with this sort of crisis, the second crisis comes is the crisis on debt, which is now has slightly triggered, but it's not, I think the impact has not yet been felt on the debt crisis. So when the government suspended on April 12th on all our debt repayments, mainly the external debt repayments, except Sri Lanka development bonds, so then that the debt crisis has triggered, so we have to move for the debt restructuring. I'll provide a quick overview later on my presentation. And then third comes the crisis on the financial system, because when we go to debt restructuring, basically some of these international debt is owned by Sri Lankan banks. So depending on our restructuring model, there may be an impact on the financial system. And already I think the high interest rates that all have some level of impact on the entire financial system. That's the third crisis. Fourth crisis is the political crisis. So if you look at the past 2 years, there have been about 4 finance ministers. Currently, we don't have a finance minister, and there have been 3 governments in the recent future. So those are all normal conditions in a crisis. If you look at Greece, Argentina, countries who have gone through similar debt crises, this is the same situation. Because it becomes politically unstable, because especially a country like Sri Lanka, where most of the essential services are provided by the government, including fuel, electricity, gas. So generally the pressure comes towards the government. So there will be frequent changes on the political stage. So that's what we experience as the political crisis. And the 5th crisis is the humanitarian crisis. So that also somewhat triggered, I mean, there were unfortunate incidents on 9th of May, and we have seen often fights at petrol stations, and there are some shortages of life-saving drugs and things like that. People die in queues, and all those comes to a humanitarian level. And that's the 5th crisis. We have to understand all these 5 crises not coming in one particular order. It comes and goes, and it stays for some time. That's the nature of the crisis. And so that's the broader framework. So in a crisis situation like this, the uncertainty and the chaos becomes normal. So we have to prepare for that. And I mean, now what has happened has happened. There's no point crying over spilled milk. So we have to get prepared for what's coming up. Then I'll move to the debt restructuring. So Sri Lanka has a lot of debt. And the problem with Sri Lanka's debt is it's unsustainable. And it's very expensive. The debt we have, what happened was we borrowed a lot of money in US dollars, dollar denominated debts in short maturity and invested in non-revenue generating properties or assets, which became later a liability. And after some time, the debt snowballed. We had to borrow more dollars at very high interest rates just to settle the interest and the debt servicing, not for anything like education or healthcare or things like that. So as a result, when you borrow more money to pay the interest at a further higher interest rate, of course, the debt is going to snowball. And that's what exactly happened. And other than that, there were some other, I think, policy decisions which was not very, I would say, short-sighted policy measures also contributed to the policy. And at the same time, the global economic situation was also not very supportive. The commodity prices were increasing. There's a Ukrainian war, and generally the geopolitical tensions are there. So all those things are, the external environment was also moving forward. So now we have to restructure our debt. Now the debt restructuring is a very complicated process. It's very technical, and we should understand what the general view of debt restructuring is. It is equal to a civil war. When you especially go through a debt crisis and when the restructuring takes longer, it will be a very painful process. Anyway, debt restructuring will be a painful process for everybody. It will be painful for people. It will be painful for the creditors who have extended us money. It will be painful for the country's government, everybody. Because, you know, I borrowed money from Upuli and I come back and say, Upuli, look, I can't pay. It can't be a pleasant environment. It can't be a pleasant relationship. So this is going to happen, and the debt restructuring very in simple terms, there are four main ways of debt restructuring. Now, Sri Lanka, I'm only talking about the external debt. External debt means the debt that we have taken from on foreign currency, in dollars or yens or yuans or in other currencies. So we have three categories of debt, mainly the multilateral debt. That is basically the institutes like Asian Development Bank, World Bank, multilateral agencies. They are considered as senior creditors because they generally provide loans for a longer maturity time at very low interest rates. So generally their debt is not restructured. Second is the bilateral debts, that is the government to government debt, like borrowings from China, Japan, France, Australia, India. And these bilateral creditors are in two main categories. Some of them are Paris Club members, some of them are non-Paris Club members. So in the Sri Lankan context, Japan is a Paris Club member. Our main two other creditors are India and China. Both of them are non-Paris Club members. They have sometimes go to the observation status. So our debt restructuring will have a split there. And third is the financial markets. That is the international sovereign bonds, some of the debt that we have taken from China Exim Bank, likewise. So in a debt restructuring, there are four ways to do it. Very simply, it can be complicated. I'm simplifying it for everyone's understanding, convenience understanding. First is, imagine I borrowed 1,000 rupees from Upuli at 6% interest rate to pay back in 5 years. The first thing is the first model is I come to Upuli and say, look, I borrowed you 1,000 rupees. I can't pay 1,000 rupees. I'll pay you 500 rupees at 6% interest rate and in 5 years. So that called a haircut. So basically Upuli has to take a haircut for her 1,000 rupees borrowed to me. She will only get repaid by 500. Like she has a 50% haircut. The second model is I come to Upuli and say, Upuli, I'll pay you 1,000 rupees, but I can't pay you at 6% interest. I'll pay you at 2% interest in 5 years. So then we call it coupon clipping. So Upuli has to bear the interest Upuli has to let go of the interest of 4 rupees, 4%. The third one is I say, Upuli, I'll come and pay you 1,000 rupees at 6% interest, but I can't pay you in 5 years. I'll pay you in 10 years. We call it the extended maturity. That's the third option. And the fourth is a mix and match. I say, Upuli, look, I come and I'll pay you 750 rupees at 5% interest at 7 years. A mix and match. And also there are complicated, I just simplified it, but in debt restructuring, there are multiple ways. Some other countries are going to buy other countries' debt. Sometimes you issue another bond instead of the current bond at a different interest rate. So there are a lot of complicated debt restructuring methods as well. So in the Sri Lanka's debt restructuring status, we have called, so this debt restructuring is again a very complicated process. So generally the rule of thumb is none of the partners are going to first agree on the debt restructuring, because I have borrowed from Upuli, I have borrowed from Vagisha, I have borrowed from Nirmala, I have borrowed from all over. So when I come and say, look, I can't pay debt, I have borrowed from all of you, I can't pay you now, can you give me a debt relief? No one is going to give me a preferential treatment. Upuli won't say, okay, you take 50% of my debt, I'll take a haircut of 50%, and you let Nirmala and Vagisha to give a 20% haircut. That won't happen, because then that means most of the debt burdening is going to take by only Upuli. That won't happen. So everyone, the bilateral creditors and the multilateral bilateral creditors and the market creditors will all negotiate for a probably like a equal relief. So what they are going to do is they will ask if they will first disagree with the debt restructuring. So far we have suspended on like single-handedly, and we are appointing the financial advisors and the technical advisors, which has not been published yet. So then when we go to the debt restructuring, they will also come up with their terms. And especially we have to understand on the market debt, these sovereign bonds are issued in the New York state law or with the London law. So these are has to handle at international capacity on debt restructuring, because, and also some of these bonds are very complicated. Their legal structure are very complicated. I am not technically, I mean, I'm not an expert on that. So there are cross default clauses and so many clauses which are very complicated. So so then what happens is, when they agree for a debt restructuring model, they will first ask, they will try to get as much as possible to restructure it. So they will ask to restructure the domestic debt, international debt, everything. The pain amongst many people. So your pain become minimal, because if you have to restructure about 51 billion debt, if you are restructuring it about amongst 10 people versus 100 people, makes a big difference on the pain that you get. So you try to get as much as possible people into the restructuring process and try to negotiate. So that's the next step. And they try to get restructure the domestic debt and the multilateral debt as well. But generally multilateral debt is not restructured. Sometimes in the restructuring negotiation tables, that has also been argued why multilaterals are provided the senior creditor status. So all these are very, very complicated. And generally the debt restructuring can take 6 months or 9 months, or even it can extend it for 2-3 years. Now, what we have to avoid is, we have to get I think when we get the debt restructuring, if we don't get an adequate debt restructuring, there's a higher risk that we go and default on the same restructured debt. That we have to avoid. And there can be a very bad, painful experiences which will remembered by the markets, and they will quote very high interest rates in future bonds if we go to the bond markets. That will have that will cause us to bear very high financial cost in the future. And also the reputation of the country will be tarnished, because anyway, when you go for a restructuring in the future bonds, that will be remembered by the market, and they will cost for that in the future bonds as well. And we are doing it for the first time. We haven't done it. Even though I speak about restructuring, I haven't taken part in any restructuring process. It's a very technical process. So we are doing it for the first time. So we have very minimal experience on this. And also there are a lot of geopolitical tensions with China, Japan, India, with Quad and everything. So that will have an impact. So all these together, it's a challenging time. But on a very positive note, I think it's also a good opportunity to reform our economy and to move in a new direction, allow the markets to work. And I think compared to countries like Lebanon, I think we have started to an extent some of the negotiations quite early. I know it's a very painful period, but the worst could be to extend this painful period. So on some of these things, I think we have started. We are late, but we are early than some of the worst cases in our region and in the world. So in that sense, we are somewhat positive. And the thing is, countries like Ecuador and all that, they have some resources like oil refineries and all that, but we don't have. Though we say Sri Lanka is a resourceful country, of course we have resources, but we are a small island, and we don't have resources that can be converted into money in a short period. But the positive side is we are a small economy. So as we all know, some of the big companies in the world, their economic size of their companies more than Sri Lanka's economy. So it's not a big amount if we really play our cards right. But I think the important thing is to restructure the entire economy on a very, on a sustainable path. So now the impact on the town planners, I'll stop from there since I think I'm almost with my time. So with the town planners, the challenge would be, I think there are a lot of import restrictions going to come in. Already there are a lot of import restrictions. The construction material are difficult and the prices are increasing. So I think in moving forward, there'll be a bit of a slow growth on the construction side, because one side the global commodity prices have increased, and on the other side we don't have foreign reserves to basically buy or import this material. And we had a growth model of driven with construction, and that will somewhat come to bit of a slow phase, in my view, and it will be a bit of a slow period in terms of construction. So that's my overview. But and generally the most frequent question is how long will it take to recover from this? I hope the shortages and all, basically the essentials like fuel and all that, at least it will take about 3 to 6 months if we get some level of agreement with our bilateral partners and some bridge financing and all that. That's one option. It can go, I mean, it won't just go away like, overnight. It will stay for some time. And generally, it was said in literature, it takes about 6 to 10 years to recover for an economy if we do it right. If we play the cards right, if we do the reforms right, it will take about 6 to 10 years for the recovery phase. And it's not an easy task. It's a difficult path, but I think there is no point on worrying about too many things. But we have to put our act together and work towards the recovery phase. I'll stop from there. Thanks, Upali.
Right. Thank you very much, Dhananath. So now, and thank you for putting everything in a very simplified form. So now I would like to invite Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara. Dr. Vagisha, I would like to ask you now, what are the new value drivers in the macroeconomic policies and the opportunities for innovative and sustainable financing in Sri Lanka? That particularly comes in the form of thematic bonds. And certainly, if you wish to add any comments to Mr. Dhananath's talk, also I wish to give you a few minutes for that as well. So Dr. Vagisha, this session is over to you.
Thank you, Puli. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be in your presence and to share some ideas with you. And I'd like to thank KERP and Institute of Town Planners of Sri Lanka for reaching out to UNDP to share the knowledge and experience we have gathered in supporting some of these innovative financing agendas and instruments, both in Sri Lanka and in the region. Upuli, to answer your question, I think I'll probably answer your question with my presentation. About the general comments about the overview that was provided by Dhananath, that was quite comprehensive and, as you say, very easy to understand. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A if other people have questions. But I'll get right to the point here so that it gives everybody, all the participants, some time to think about what Dhananath said, but also think about some possible solutions, and then we can trigger the conversation later on. Does that sound okay? Okay.
Yes, yes, sure.
I hope I'm fully audible to everybody.
Yes, yes.
So urbanization, right? All of you are town city planners who work with the built environment. Now, urbanization, I don't need to tell you what it is, but we all know that it's a defining trend of our time. In the year 1900, 13% of the world's population lived in a city. But by 2030, the urban population will have increased from today's 3.5 billion to 5 billion. More than 50% of the global population. So you are working with this demographic trend, which is I think a very huge responsibility on your shoulders. So the big challenge with urban growth is that it's expensive. In both developed and developing markets, central or state government bodies have financed most of urban infrastructure, which is also centrally planned and maintained. But municipalities, either because of the lack of money or the capability of cover up, upfront costs of key infrastructure and upgrades, there've been issues. Investors, on the other hand, they face, what we call a bankable projects gap. This idea was not introduced by me; it's introduced by a Harvard Business School professor. His name is John McComber. He talked about this bankable projects gap. What this means is that urban infrastructure projects tend to offer uncertain revenues. So there are disagreements over guarantees, there are concerns about political risks, and the set of issues grow into this one big constellation. And where a single asset's standalone cash flows can be understood, whether it's a highway or a power plant or apartment building, the investment value of typical multi-sector urban opportunities, mostly urban infrastructure projects resulting from the use of the city's tools such as rezoning, land reuse, or partnerships in utilities or sanitation services, they can be harder for financial evaluation. So how can urban assets yield returns more attractive to a range of private and public or even collective, right? It could be cooperatives, investors. So in my presentation today, I'd like to show you a few examples from around the world of current attempts at urban funding innovations. And these are all countries that are going through economic crises like ours. As Dhananath also said, it's always easy to say that, it's only us that are in a crisis, but that is not true. A lot of other developing countries, I've worked in so many of them in the region, in the Asia Pacific region, and also in Africa, and I've seen worse situations. So for me, looking at the larger canvas, this is one of many such crises. It just happened to be ours, right? But there are funding innovations. And as a precursor to these examples that I'm about to share with you about innovative financing for urban infrastructure projects, I also want to touch on the gamut of sustainable, or what we call green financing options that are generally available for countries like ours. So let me share my screen. I hope everyone can see this.
yes, it's visible.
Okay, so there is a growing trend in development finance to focus on ensuring closer interlinkages between economic, environmental, and the social dimensions. Upuli, you talked about the value systems that we bring in with these new financing options. So this is one such example of, you know, the idea of green jobs, where you tie economic growth and environment together, and also social outcomes. There is also this principle of do no harm when it comes to certain investments. So the government has, any government, this is not just Sri Lanka, but any government has different levers at its disposal to enhance sustainable finance. And these are increasingly interconnected. You can see that, I mean, it's really important to align development plans and budgets using green or sustainable fiscal policy. And for that, we need to have a national plan, or at least a 5-year plan. Right now, Sri Lanka has 2 such policy frameworks. One is the Vistas framework, Vistas for Prosperity and Splendor, that document. And then we have the Public Investment Review, which outlines some of the development priorities and how they're going to be funded. But they really have to align with each other. But the Public Investment Review is also an opportunity for governments to come together to discuss how are we really going to finance this using the mix of instruments that are available for us. So right now, I mean, I don't know if the audience, if you have seen the 2021 to 2024 public investment program, it weighs heavily on the physical infrastructure, not so much on the social infrastructure, but you can see that there is a lot of work that could be done to improve the investment side of it. And what that means is also looking at public, private, banks, right? And innovative green finance. And I'll be talking about certain types of thematic bonds today. I'll touch on them. And there are so many other arrangements when it comes to innovative financing for, environmental, social, and economic goals to achieve them. So we need to think about that pillar. Thirdly, how do we align private investment and also our national goals? That's really important to think about. And, how to mitigate risk, tapping into opportunities, but at the same time, not compromising on our social goals. And lastly, there's so many steps that could be taken to green the financial system. And Sri Lanka has taken some steps in that direction. I'll be talking about them in a little bit here. We've got to start, okay? That's really positive, but there's a lot of work left to do. So I'll move on to quickly touching on some innovative financing instruments. So for a country like Sri Lanka, I mean, our fiscal space for development is now really constrained. All of us know that. So one question is, are there options for this kind of sustainable, innovative financing? The short answer is not right away, not in the short term, not in the next 3 to 6 months, but it's certainly an option for the medium term. So among these green financing or sustainable financing instruments, we have several asset classes. And the most common ones are the equity-based financing options. So we have junior and senior equity type arrangements, and then we have debt financing, right? And so these are green and sustainability use of proceeds bonds. There are certain things called pay for success instruments and KPI bonds, and green loans, of course. So when it comes to equity, so equity is non-debt finance, right? So we need to get investors who are willing to just put forward their equity towards certain projects here that are high on their returns, right? So right now, the space for that may be a little less considering the economic situation, but it certainly is an option once things get better. So this table just shows you a few of the thematic bonds that are our options, right? So under the International Capital Market Association, ICMA, there is a framework for ESG bond instruments and these sustainability type bonds instruments. And there are three main bonds that we work with. So the green bonds. So the underlying projects that are green eligible, which means they're always tied to an environmental goal or a KPI. Then we have blue bonds. So the underlying projects that have to do with the marine environment. We have, and both of them have environmental and social benefits. And thirdly, we have these very popular ones these days called the sustainability bonds, which raise funds for projects with both green and social benefits. But this is just a few options. There's so many. I can't go into detail on any of these. I mean, the way some of these bonds work, it's individual. There's quite a bit of technical work that goes into the pre-issuance stage, then the issuance, and then the post-issuance stage. And then afterwards, the bond is issued, how the KPIs are monitored. It's all very case by case specific, right? It's context specific. So right now I'm working on a blue bond for Fiji. And after about 6 years, the blue bond for Fiji is coming through. And there's a lot of different contextual factors that go into designing these bonds. It would take me like 2 days to go over all of them, so I'll just be very quick. Now, this is to tell you that the sustainable debt market, this is as of 2020, this is based on 2020 data, it amounts to about $1.7 trillion. So green bonds contribute to a major share of about 290 million USD. And that's followed by social bonds, which is about 249 million USD. And sustainability bonds, a relatively smaller share at about 160 million. So despite the ramifications of the pandemic, these issuance of green bonds went up by about 9% from 2019 to 2020. And the social bonds and sustainability bonds saw enormous uptake with about a growth rate of 101%, and also 101% was in 2019 and 131% in 2020. So this growth of social sustainability bonds was predominantly because governments and corporates shifted their focus to enhancing social outcomes. So in the global ESG market, about 85% of the proceeds were directed predominantly to energy, low carbon buildings, and transport. You can see the use of proceeds breakdown here. So as you can see, the energy, low carbon building, transport, they're the favorites of these bond market investors. Water infrastructure and waste management are other sectors that are also popular and gaining a lot of traction in the bond market. So we can see how capital markets are also driven more towards sustainable investments and risk and return. And they're balancing towards investment in clean technology, energy, and green transportation. So we see a significant focus on standards, matrix, ways of ensuring that the system of accounting for green investment is strengthened. Now, this is a fundamental aspect of the systems change we need, where it's possible to transparently account for the use of finance, public and private, in line with sustainable development. This is the growth of SDG and green bonds in the Asia Pacific region. And these are some examples of, this is Indonesia, China, Fiji, Mexico, and Uzbekistan are some very recent examples where UNDP has directly been engaged in the issuance of bonds or developing taxonomies or bond frameworks. Now, I want to get into some examples of innovative growth, particularly in cities. So how have cities or city planners or mayors or city governments have used innovative financing options to develop cities' infrastructure, the built environment? So each of these examples involve multiple stakeholders, often including municipalities, capital market participants, development banks, technology companies, as well as venture capital. And each relies on a governance or financial innovation, and importantly, sort of offers up a municipal finance solution that aims to be revenue generating. So it's another way to think of, you know, whether it is the UDA or it is the municipality of Colombo, think of yourself as a revenue generating unit and engage in this process. So the first example I'm bringing to you is this idea of tax incremental financing, TIF, to next generation municipal bonds for social investments. So municipalities are not commonly revenue generating units, as I said earlier. Public financing for urban projects has been raised traditionally from tax revenue. So this idea of tax increment financing is a public financing method that is used as a subsidy for redevelopment, infrastructure, and other community improvement projects in many countries, including the countries in the developed world, like the US, where I spent a lot of time studying and working. So through the use of this TIF, this increment financing, municipalities typically divert future property tax revenue increases from a defined area or district towards an economic development project or public improvement project in the community. And the TIF subsidies are not appropriated directly from the city's budget, but the city incurs a loss through foregone tax revenue. And if the cost of basic services increases with the TIF in place, the result is a revenue shortfall that has to be paid from sources other than tax revenues of the TIF district or to prevent the service cuts. And if you want to go and look for examples of this kind, you can check out the state of Massachusetts in the US. It has this program called ROCA. It's aimed at avoiding criminal recidivism. So it's tied to a social goal. And the bond is created a risk-bearing financial arrangement between private, public, and non-profit organizations. And the state will repay the investors their principal with a sliding scale of profit tied to a degree of success. Okay, you can, I won't go into details about these case studies. You can, I'll give you the presentation and I'll give you the examples later on to curb so that any of you can go and look them up on the internet when you have time. The second example is the idea of developing world cities issuing on, deepening local and international capital markets. I want to give you the example of Dakar, the capital of Senegal in Africa. It sought to issue municipal bonds on the local exchange in a move that was set to open up debt markets for the first time to cities in sub-Saharan Africa. This was to allow Dakar to incur long-term debt, something many other cities in the developing world don't have. So in that sense, the bond issuer becomes the city of Dakar, right? So previous borrowings from commercial banks and other parties gave Dakar experience before, trying to float a bond. So they work very closely with these commercial parties. And Dakar sought a confidential credit rating from Moody's for the city itself, which offered a management roadmap for what steps the city needed to take to become creditworthy. And the US aid also supported in putting together this financial infrastructure for Dakar. This is Dakar's, just an aerial view of Dakar's plan. I'll move on quickly to the third example. That is this idea of venture capital in urban technologies. And the best example I can give you is a Google-backed company called Sidewalk Labs that manages a large pool of capital in the world focused on urban innovation. In 2016, they've launched free Wi-Fi kiosks across public areas in New York City. The idea was to access municipal services, and in an effort to make the fastest public Wi-Fi in the world freely available, with the stated benefit of reducing their spend on data plans. That is currently being implemented in Toronto as well at the moment. The next example I want to give is urban real estate finance. So in this model, urban real estate finance, I mean, it's certainly, you know, it's about pooled finance development fund schemes. We call them PFDFs. So they're like the first loss-like schemes backed by corporate partners. They enable government authorities to provide credit enhancement facilities to urban local bodies based on their credit worthiness. So in result, these urban local bodies can access further market borrowings through state level pooled mechanism. And as such, they can have further resources to improve the urban infrastructure and ultimately attain the goal of self-sustainability. So some examples of this are, you know, in Mexico City, the municipal infrastructure projects, they worked very closely with the Mexican company CEMEX, being a market leader in partaking in a pavement construction model in Mexico, where local citizens can be shareholders of the investment project. Then pooled finance investment plans, such as this photograph is from Colombia. So Colombia's Metro Vivienda project. This is in Bogota, in their capital. So it's a basic strategy to acquire through negotiated purchase of privately owned open space in suburbs to create these large assemblages of improved infrastructure, which are planned and parcels, to sell to experienced developers for construction of market rate housing, which is affordable to various levels of low-income families. My fifth example, distributed ledger technology. This is blockchain-based land registration and payments platform. Sorry, this is not the correct image for it, but I'll just talk about this. So in Honduras and Ghana, municipal governments have collaborated with software companies, local ones as well as international ones, to address inefficiencies in land administration, to build next generation and more transparent land registration, title and payment management solutions. So these platforms use the blockchain technology to track assets, payments and administrative processes to bring accountability and trust into land investments. So there is this thing called a citizens portal, which allows users to manage their property and interact with local real estate markets in real time. In many cases, the first projects of these platform companies are to first digitize and land cadastre, so asset identification, before the platform could become revenue generating. And my last example here is enterprise solutions for urban mass transportation. The public sector has historically been, you know, the key financier of urban transportation infrastructure, but now new private sector models for financing public transportation are cropping up around the world. What you see is the photograph of Mexico City's Avenida Chapultepec. Okay, it's one of their native words. It's a project that's an interesting example of innovating urban transport infrastructure financing. So there's a white paper about this called A Field Guide to the Future of Mobility. This project basically gives a 40-year concession to a private trust that will be in charge of developing and operating this transport operation, as well as a cultural corridor that is in this city. So in this model, a private investor will provide necessary resources to build and maintain the project and will receive income directly from the services offered in the corridor, including an expected return on investment. So Mexico City's government receives a small percentage of the yearly income. And this particular locality, this particular city, which is in the heart of Mexico City, it will evolve to become a 3-level linear park. You know, it is three levels, as you can see. It incorporates public and private transportation, pedestrian and retail areas. So in a nutshell, these 6 examples are just a selection of innovative efforts at financing next generation urban assets. But as these demonstrate, both investor appetite and public interest in structuring financing of urban investments for urban investments, including infrastructure, it exists in our part of the world too, right? I mean, these are developing countries. And we can certainly explore these further once our situation improves a little bit. And I want to actually, before I end with a summary of these recommendations, I want to sort of touch on this particular project that UNDP has been involved in Kaduwela Municipality Council. Sri Lanka, has a problem with waste source. I mean, you are all planners. I don't need to go into detail about this problem. You're all well aware of it. So we know that we have this issue at the beginning at the waste source. We don't really know how to recycle properly still. All the leftovers are found in one bag. Urban cities like Colombo, we have a rapid growth and high density in the population, and the waste problem has really worsened over time. So in these rapidly growing cities, waste management has become a huge issue. So disposal of solid waste is a priority as an environmental issue in Sri Lanka, and it's become a national concern now. So UNDP has been working with Kaduwela Municipal Council for this waste management project, where we have offered multiple recycling options and composting and biogas production. And there's also sub-economies around the biogas production, the selling of metal, glass, and other recyclables, as well as partnering up with INSI Cement to direct the waste to the cement industry to be used as an alternative fuel. So right now, this project is being financed by UNDP. There's a matching fund actually. So Dhananath is the NGO that is working closely with UNDP to implement this Kaduwela Municipal Council project, the biogas project. And this is using solid waste and then preparing biogas from it. The total value of this project right now is about 10 million rupees, so not so much. And 7 million of them was given by UNDP, and the rest of them was matched by the Kaduwela Municipal Council. But I mean, this is just to give you an idea that we are already going towards some of these micro projects, but innovative finance is something that we haven't really explored much. So this is a partnership between the UN body and the municipal council's own budgets, but we can easily bring in, we have already brought in INSI Cement, but we can bring the private sector in a much bigger way if we scale it up, or if we change the project slightly around its KPIs. Okay, and my last slide here is to give you a few recommendations. These are recommendations based on various town and city planning, like using innovative financial instruments in the Asia region, including Sri Lanka. One is to provide suitable regulatory and legal environments at the national level to ensure that local and regional governments have appropriate powers and capacities to manage local and urban development. So that is really, really important. And I'm very pleased to say that Sri Lanka is taking some steps in this direction to improve the regulatory and legal environments. And the examples I can give to this end is that the central bank has a sustainable development roadmap. Recently, the central bank also launched the green taxonomy, which supports this regulatory and legal environment that we're going for. So we are already taking some steps towards that. The second recommendation is that we must ensure appropriate fiscal decentralization and sharing of national resources. So it's important that we have a productive, set of productive sources of revenue, local taxes. We can do land value capture, some type of business taxation, etc., and regular and predictable transfers to support the execution of local and regional governments' responsibilities. The third would be to increase technical assistance and capacity building for subnational governments to develop their capacities to raise local taxes and improve budget management, enhance their own creditworthiness, design bankable projects, and implement infrastructure for the provision of basic services that respond to the community's local needs. And we can look at plenty of examples from Cambodia, for example, very successful involvement of residents, private companies, local authorities in planning and decision making to improve the local living conditions. We can also look to China for some of these examples. Then strengthen local governments' access to instruments enabling them to raise long-term financing, whether it's from the banking system, the financial markets, international grants and loans, through the creation of, say, well-structured and well-justified guarantee mechanisms to secure investments. We can take a lot of examples from Indonesia. The Green Urban Transport Project in Palembang is a good example to this end. And lastly, we can improve monitoring of official flows, so international financial institutions, official development assistance, and emerging actors invested in local infrastructure and services in the development of local and regional government capacities. And I'll close by saying that, it's really important to develop innovative and responsible ways for, even multilateral development banks to lend to local and regional governments. Whether, there could be sovereign loans. China has certainly done this very successfully in the past 25 years, and ensure these local bodies to access global, regional, and national climate change and sustainability related financing mechanisms, so that they facilitate investments in adaptation infrastructure. I'll end here. I'll take any questions whenever we get to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Vagisha, for comprehensively talking about this innovative and sustainable financing options that developing countries would have. To see the central bank already launched this green financing taxonomy, and in principle and regulatory wise, giving their support to implement that. But on the other hand, it would be important for us to ensure also the preparedness, to what extent all this, because we know that, for example, introduced REITs with regulations, but still it didn't work because it is not still socially accepted. So I think that is one part, particularly in a society like Sri Lanka, that one needs to work on, to have the sort of validation and see and to make people aware more on these options as conventional options that we have. Now, a quick question following up your planning for is to see now the key question that some are asking is sectors that we had already relied on, sectors that we can tap in together with our existing economic sectors. I know that you spoke about there had been a recent investigation, so we would like to take few minutes if you can share what does this new investigations reveal about the economic sectors that we can think about, particularly short-term and medium-term.
Puli, the question is for me, right? Your voice was breaking up.
I'm sorry, Vagisha. Yes, it's for you. The question was, now we've been talking particularly for these economic recovery stages, we were talking about what sectors that we can focus on, and some were arguing whether we have done with the existing sectors. For example, now we are relying on tourism and we are relying on certain other sectors like apparel sector. So can we think of new sectors together with the existing sectors? Because you spoke about there had been a recent investigation on this, exploring different sectors for the economy. So what does that investigation reveal? So if we can have a few more minutes to go with that.
Yes, I think the best source I can use for this to answer your question is that Sri Lanka is doing what we call a Sustainable Development Goal Investor Map. We're doing it, so the UN system is doing it in conjunction with the Chambers of Commerce, as well as the Ministry of Finance. And in that exercise, what we do is we map areas of potential growth for which there is regional and global financing options, both concessionary and non-concessionary, and that give us a long-term horizon in terms of growth for that particular sector. And in Sri Lanka, I mean, you mentioned tourism and apparels. Tourism still surfaces as an important sector in that mapping exercise. However, it's a niche kind of tourism that has come out to be more profit worthy, or you know, like when you look at the long-term horizon, it's the type of eco-based tourism models that have come out as more attractive to investors. But the number one sector that has come up as really, really important for the investors, for investors on Sri Lanka's projects, is the renewable energy. And as we all know, we are currently having an energy crisis. We like to talk about our reserves in terms of only dollars. And in my view, the current crisis has given enough evidence to shift our thinking about this idea of reserves into reserves of energy, reserves in water, reserves in food, right? These three very basic things. And Sri Lanka, thankfully, has a sound policy on paper, at least. We are geared to achieve, we have the political commitment to develop our renewable energy sector. We have a plan to go for 70% renewables by 2050, if I'm not mistaken. That is the current policy direction. However, so on the one hand, this is a very important sector that has immense growth, that also has high appetite by investors to invest in Sri Lanka. But what is stopping us? We certainly have the policy infrastructure. There's no issue with our policy. But when it comes to implementation, there's a slew of issues regarding the political economy. This is not economy anymore, not just economy. This is the political economy in the country that is posing obstacles towards the achievement of renewable energy targets in Sri Lanka, and also preventing future investments. And I'm sure all of you know what I mean by political economy. Even in the energy sector, you know, there are vested interests of people sometimes within the departments itself that block renewable energy projects. So that is because over time, over the decades, there are built-in sub-economies that are, you know, that feed off each other. The state, the sub-economies, you know, these interest groups, they all fuse together. So it is that setup, that political economy, that is preventing us from going towards investments, larger investments in solar or wind or nuclear or whatever it is that we want to go for. It's the political economy that is blocking it. Another sector that has become really attractive in this particular investigation that we're doing, the investor maps, is high value agriculture. So there, I mean, two types of agriculture. We need agriculture for food security, but at the same time, agriculture for commercial purposes. So high value agriculture has become quite attractive to some investors. And what we mean by this is the type of agriculture where you use a lot of high-tech solutions, don't have a lot of high land requirement. It could be vertical farms, aquaculture, that sort of thing. So those are two of these examples, but the investor map is scheduled to come out in the next couple of months. There will be a launch in the next couple of months, and I'll be sure to give you heads up when it comes out so that you can have access to the entire mapping exercise. I hope I answered your question, Upuli.
Certainly, yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Vagisha. And I see there's a compliment for you as well in the chat box for your talk. And now I would like to move to Mr. Dhananath. So Mr. Dhananath, I would like to ask you now, when we are particularly talking about this economic recovery and this economic crisis, one of the key questions that one is asking is that how do we prioritize projects, particularly these development projects? So first, you are also given a few minutes to add anything to Dr. Vagisha's talk, and also to speak about how would you reckon about project prioritizing and about the monitoring and the process outcomes. Dr. Mr. Dhananath.
Thanks, Subuli. Thanks, Vagisha, for that comprehensive presentation. I have nothing much to disagree with Vagisha or like to add on, but I would like to, on the recommendations, now this as connecting to police question as well, how are we going to finance these projects? I think Vagisha also mentioned, especially on the taxes and like the revenue collection models, that we have to make it sustainable. I think that's something that we have to think about on the macroeconomic framework. Now, for an example, imagine if you are going to develop Anuradhapura as a new town with some according to the national priorities. Just imagine. So basically, the land value of those adjacent areas will go really high, right? So then actually those residents around that area will have a financial benefit because of the taxpayer money or the financing models that we have implemented. Their land values will be increased. So ideally, that increment, there has to be a contribution for the future projects as well. Now, I know this happened when we developed highways and all that. All those politicians who knew that this highway project is going to come, they bought the land adjacent to that interchanges. So then they buy it at like a very low price, and then once the project was going, those land prices increase very high, and then they just sold it, and we call it in economics, you make a rent without adding any productive capacity to the economy. You are making a big profit without doing anything on someone else's public money. So that's something I think that we have to think about, having that macroeconomic framework on what needs to be done. And on prioritizing, Upuli, I think this is a common question. I think this is where most of the planners and economists don't see eye to eye. I think the planning process is what's important, because the current dynamic environment, definitely we should have a plan. But the economy, planning economy is somewhat different to like planning a project, because as Thomas Sall famously said, in every resource there's a scarcity. That's the fundamental of economics. But in politics, the fundamental is you forget the first principle of economics. You work like there's no scarcity. So when you manage the scarcity, we have to allow the market system to work. That's where through prices you manage the resources. So that's what we have to do. And in terms of moving forward, I think on these projects, the sustainability financing model is what we need to do, because if most of our infrastructure projects, as you all know, it was debt financed, and we are not reaping out we are not getting enough revenue to service the debt. So that's one reason why we are in this bit of mess. I'll quickly share one slide which called this debt overhanging problem. So basically, when you do that debt financing on project manage, on infrastructure projects. So in Sri Lanka, we have about 51 billion now about external debt in dollars. You see 51 billion US dollars. So when your debt to GDP rate in 0 to 30, generally, according to the world data, it's about it's about 4.6% average growth. But when your debt to GDP ratio is increasing from 30 to 60, 60 to 90, above 90, your growth drops. So that's one reason we have to move for more sustainable financing models, because otherwise we will finding it difficult to manage it. So that's my overall view, Upuli. I think the prioritizing and having that broad economic framework to work is important in moving forward.
Thank you so much. And now we can move on to the Q&A. We already have two questions.
Can I make a quick correction before we? Sorry.
Yes, Dr. Vagisha, yes.
Yes, I would like to make a quick correction. I made a mistake in saying that the SDG, the investor maps, I think I accidentally said the Ministry of Finance, but it's not the Ministry of Finance, it's actually the Sustainable Development Council in Sri Lanka that is spearheading the exercise of SDG investor maps together with the support of UNDP. So I just want to make that correction.
Right, thank you so much. So now let's move on to the questions. We already have like 3 questions. I guess both the questions, I assume both the questions are for Dhananath. So the first question is asking about cross-default clause with an example. So this was asked by Planner Dorakumbura. Please enlighten on cross-default clause with an example.
Basically, again, I'm not an expert on this subject, so I'm also sharing my views on based on my readings, because I haven't taken part in any of the debt restructuring processes. So basically, cross default is there are certain bonds connected to some other bonds. And also when you now, for an example, I'll quickly share my screen back again. Yeah, so when you look at the bonds that we have issued now, yes, so these are the bonds that we have issued on the financial market since October 7th. So as you can see, the value is given on the y-axis, and the date of the bond that was issued was given in the x-axis. So some of these bonds so when you all these bonds have like different maturities. What is in the dark ash color is basically 5 years bonds. What is in dark like the magenta is about 10.8 years bonds. So likewise there are bonds. So when you default on, now already we have defaulted on one bond. So basically when you default in one bond, that means you have defaulted on all the future bonds as well. So there will be clauses in each bond which has an impact on the other bonds that you have issued. So that's why the restructuring process becomes very complicated for any debt restructuring, because you can't just say, okay, we defaulted on the bond on April 18 and let's restructure that and we'll pay the 2030 bond. Let's be without restructuring. That can't happen, because the bondholders will say, if you are not restructuring the July 2030 bond or 2035 bond, which is 15 years from now, but when you're restructuring my debt now, which is due on 2022 April, basically you are allocating my resources to pay a bond in 15 years. So that's the problem. And also now, for an example, Sri Lanka paid a 500 million bond in January, and we paid interest thereafter. And one of the other questions that's going to come in the negotiation table, if you knew that your debt is unsustainable, and if you have cut down from the by the rating agencies, the rating was downgraded, and you know that you can't go back to the markets to raise more finances, why did you pay that? Because you basically bailed out one set of bondholders under the expense of mine, because now I have a bond to be matured in April, but you bailed out one set of creditors in January at my cost. Now you bailed out them, and now I have to bear their cost as well, because you bailed out one set of creditors. That's one. And also there's another one called you call it the cross. Basically, there's a on some bonds there's a super majority can decide whether we are going to restructure or not. It's called the collective action clauses. So this allows the super majority of the bondholders to agree on a debt restructuring that is legally binding all the bondholders. So in the Sri Lanka's context, about 36% of our bonds are having collective action clauses. So that will be slightly difficult to restructure. So this is that chart. So if you can see the title, the 36% of our ISBs have classic collective action clauses, which are harder to restructure. So what is in the dark pink is the classic collective action clauses, and what is in the ash color is the double-limbed collective action clause. So that's why I said Sri Lanka's debt restructuring will be quite challenging. But I mean, we have to go through that process. It's painful, but we have to go through that. That's the question. That's the answer for the
right. Okay. Thank you so much. And the next question is by Plan Kishan Sugatapala. So what the question is about, now this economic issue seems to be addressed at national level. So the question is whether there are any possibilities that the issue can be handled or addressed at local and regional level. This question is particularly addressed to Dhananath, but I suppose both Vagisha and Dhananath, both you can give your thoughts on this matter.
Vagisha, do you want to take a first go on it?
Go ahead, Dhananath.
Okay. So on the regional level, Upuli, I don't, how should I say that? So in terms of increasing income and all that, sometimes on the regional level, there will be some tax increases in my view. That will have an impact. But otherwise, according to our governance structure, most of these decisions are taken at the central level. And at the individual level, so basically when the inflation increases and all that, you are doing a contribution, knowingly or unknowingly, to cover the cost of these matters. So at the regional level, I am not very sure. Basically, all these regional capital expenditures and all those things are going to come to a standstill. And that circular has already been issued by the Treasury Secretary, Dr. Mahinda Siriwardana, that to stop all the capital expenditures. So that will have a massive impact on your professional category, on town planning and all that, because that expenditure is going to cut down. And also the other project funding that also, from what I hear, which was received by World Bank and some other multilateral agencies, except for some projects, they are going to direct it into the essential services. So that will also basically crowding out some of the funds which was given for town planning. So those are my broader thoughts on that. Maybe since Vagisha works on it, she may have a better in-depth view on this, but I must admit I don't have a in particular view on the regional and the local level on this matter.
Just reconfirming what Dhananath says, I think it's a short-term issue. We shouldn't be optimistic that in the next 3 to 6 months that the regions would have sufficient funds to operationalize the town and city related infrastructure projects, right? But in the medium term, I think the funds will flow back. But at the same time, I think now is a good time to think about other ways in financing regional level infrastructure or town projects. And I want to show a few examples with you. I mean, these are not high capital projects, but they still serve social and also environmental ends. Okay, give me 1 second. I just want to, this idea of urban gardens, for example. This doesn't require a lot of, okay, here it is. So this is a concept. This is actually in Westchester in Pennsylvania. This is a blog written by, this is my friend, actually she and I went to university together, Ashley Delshad. She's a professor of political science at University of Westchester. And she started this concept of city gardens. And these gardens are not flowers. There are flowers in between, but they're food. So she has a lot of these, so these are public spaces, public property. She works with the municipality and she comes up with a plan. And actually it's not just her now, there's a huge following for this. And the food security and the beautification of the city is the idea. And you can see that even some private like individuals have given their gardens to be developed like this. And this is their university gardens. You can see kale and various other vegetables growing. And it's everybody's property, right? And high oxygenating plants and things like that. I mean, this is one idea, right? That's been implemented, very low cost for a city or you know, even a small town. This is something that is easily doable, and you can tap into corporate CSR, the corporate social responsibility proceeds for this kind of project. So what I'm suggesting is, until the revenue stream from the central government comes back to normal, these ideas such as this should be implemented, because it actually has a economic as well as a social goal that is being met, right? Like everybody uses these vegetables. Gardening is good for your mental, the state, you know, the mental state. You can get kids involved. So these are not like, this is not rocket science, right? We can implement smaller projects in the meantime until we get to that medium term where the country's financial, the fiscal space frees up a little bit so that towns and cities can get their budgets back to normal. I see another question in the box. Shall I answer that, Upuli? Okay, I think.
Yes, let me put down. Yeah, I think for the first question that you just answered, okay. I think in a nutshell, what you're suggesting is until the national budgets are set for a kind of a large scale financing, we can do like something that does not really require major financing with a lot of social support, social capital can be mobilized in between. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, yes. And they don't require high capital either. And and another thing I would like to suggest is that we can actually move with our planning process, right? And that planning process can still include innovative financing options, using some of these instruments with the private sector, with public-private partnerships, cooperative style. I mean, there's a entire gamut of arrangements we can work with. So I think it's a good time now to plan and put in place those plans so that when the fiscal space frees up, we can go, right? We don't need to waste any more time. So I would say not to be discouraged as a planner in these 3 to 6 months or 3 to 9 months of, really tough economic hardship and realities. And it's easy to be depressed, but I think we should never waste a crisis. Crises are also really good opportunities for us to come up with excellent ideas, creative ideas. So we shouldn't waste this crisis thinking that, oh, we are not going to get any money from the central government. Yes, that is the case, but let's use this time to implement some projects that are of low capital intensive nature, but including the communities, and that provides some relief for the issues of food security that we are going to face in the next 6 to 9 months or so.
Right.
Let's go ahead with our planning.
Yes, I think that the other question, I suppose, is that how can we go for innovative financing options with the downgraded ratings? How it affects? I wonder whether it's the same question that you were going to pick up. So would you like to read me the question again? How can we go for the innovative financing options with the downgraded ratings? How it affects?
So this slide in a nutshell, it says that the question is quite valid, right? I mean, I have the same question when people talk about green bonds and blue bonds in the current context of Sri Lanka's economic position. So right now we have defaulted. At this point in time, these thematic bond options are probably not going to be available to Sri Lanka. So this is very much a medium-term solution. So it's not an immediate-term solution. You have to have the correct fiscal position in order for us to issue these bonds. But there are other types of instruments. For example, there is a very popular instrument called the Debt for Nature swap. And the Nature Conservancy is a private I think it's a NGO / it's a corporate that is famous for these debt for nature swaps. And they, not the Nature Conservancy, but there is another bank in Switzerland. They also undertake this type of debt for nature swaps, which doesn't involve a country to have a sound credit rating. So there are other options like that, but they're quite technical and complicated, and they're also time consuming. So that is certainly the debt for nature swap is certainly an instrument that Sri Lanka can explore even at this point, right? But I must caveat this by saying all these debt for nature swap or a bond like a sustainability bond, their values are in the low millions. So they could be, $20 million or $50 million, maximum $100 million. But our requirement for debt repayment is in the billions, right? So the requirement is in billions. What you get out of this is in millions. So it's really, at this point, it's not enough. But having said that, these are still options, and we can explore the bonds, the thematic bonds in the medium term, but debt for nature swaps in the short term.
Thank you very much. And there is another question. I would like to couple two questions together to Dhananath. One question is on whether the government should invest on infrastructure projects with a payback plan. So whether always the infrastructure projects should have a certain payback plan, because sometimes we think that also contributed to a larger scale to this crisis, not having a payback also. And also there is another concern about this conversation is going on between solicited and unsolicited projects. So what are your thoughts on these subjects?
Yes, so on whether government should invest on these projects, I'll share like a practical example. So I met a couple of treasury secretaries in the last 2-3 years, even like the previous treasury secretary. So I asked them, how do you do the budget? So they start with the expenditure proposal. So each minister comes up with his own wish list. Okay, I want to, the energy minister says, okay, I want to build this power plant, I want to build this. The highway minister comes and say, I want to do this. So they bring up with all the proposals, submit, and they first start with the expenditure proposals. So they say, okay, we do this. And then you come back and think, okay, for this expenditure, let's see how are we going to find the revenue. And then you adjust the taxes and you see, okay, we borrow from this and that. So that's basically what's happening, which may be good for like a billionaire to do that, because, you can raise money and all that. You can start with the expenditure side and think from the income. But I think it is not a sustainable way. Because when the central government thinks on that front, it's becoming very challenging on both sides, because at one point you can't finance the project and your entire investment is going to, your return on investment is going to be very low or negative. And also it is not the way to do it, because there's a higher chance that you can mix up the priorities. So I think the central government should finance. There are certain public goods that the private sector cannot provide. So those things, I think the central government should have a priority. But I think the important thing is that you should minimize the deviations. For an example, if I come and say I should develop Anuradhapura as a town, just as an example, and then the person in Matale will also come and say, look, if it's Anuradhapura, why not Matale? And then you come and say, why not, if it's Matale, why not Hambantota? So these things can happen. But if you have a rationale, like how you develop, I think the government has a physical planning, a physical plan, which is coming from multiple years. But when I check the numbers, those planning has also done some awkward numbers. They have assumed like many years ago that Candyville, their population will decrease and all sorts of things, which doesn't make very logical. And also in planning, you can come with a lot of excuses, right? For example, I live in Moratuwa. I can give you 1,000 reasons why Moratuwa should be like developed, right? And I'm sure someone in Sri Jayawardenepura can make the same case. But there has to be an economic analysis to be done on what basis that can be developed. So I think that overall economic analysis has to be done. I'm not a town planning expert, but what I was in my conversations, especially with the low cost housing models, I think we have to look at as Vagisha very early shared on her presentation, now with the urbanization, we have to look at the overall economic drivers. Now one example is, now everyone now talks about riding in bicycles. I think this proposal came many months ago, even without the indications of the fuel crisis. Many ministers said, okay, let's try the bicycle. But to do that bicycle in European countries, how they do it is they have a separate track for the bicycles, and their weather is somewhat different to us, so they can, without sweating, they can ride. And their housing and commuting between the workplace and their apartments are quite short. So in Sri Lanka, without having a proper public transportation system and without proper housing at the city limits, it's very difficult to have a housing plan or like a commuting plan with bicycles. Once I met John Keels, what they said was they are one of their premier apartments, which was targeted for young professionals. I think most of the people are in this call will be eligible to that. They said their apartment prices can be bring down by 40%. And by then, I am talking about 3 years ago, 3-4 years ago, I think their pricing of that apartment was about 22 million. So they said they can bring down the price by 40% if there are changes in the regulations on the city planning and on apartments and on the cost of construction material. Now, for an example, they said for young professionals, their lifestyles are so much different because they basically, sometimes they don't use a personal vehicle. They use these Ubers, Pygmies, because if they, for an example, if they stay in Union Place, it will be walking distance, or like a bike, they can reach out their workplace. So basically, it doesn't make sense for them to own a vehicle. And in the apartment regulation, you should have a separate slot for each apartment, or there's a percentage to park the vehicle. So basically, your space in the middle of the city is very high. When you allocate parking slots to as a percentage of your apartments, your cost is rapidly increasing. That's one problem. And the second one, I'm going to share this slide back again. One of the main challenges for town planners and people who are in the construction industry is this. I hope you can see my screen. Can you? I think no, right? Sorry.
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah, let me quickly share it. Yes. So if you look at the problem with why the cost of construction is also very high in Sri Lanka, basically our taxes at the border on cost of construction material, I'm sure most of you guys may be aware of this, is very high. 1 second. Seems there's a problem on my slide sharing. Yes, I hope you can see it. So this is the construction tariffs from the changes from 2005 to 2010. It has increased from 146 to 203%. That means if you're buying something like concrete, cement, and plaster, basically you're paying almost 2 times the price of that construction material. Now the problem is, especially on tourism and on other construction industries which you guys are involved. Now imagine if you're building a beach resort in Valigama, you're competing with the beach resorts in Caribbean islands or in Maldives. So when your cost of construction is about 40%, 50% higher than the region, your room prices are also has to be priced at a very high rate. So when a tour is looking at options from the Caribbean, from Europe on Caribbean islands, Sri Lanka and Maldives, they of course get very reasonable pricing for hotels in the Caribbean islands. So this cost of construction is a massive problem for everyone. And imagine, and also we have to understand on that cost, we are taking a housing loan or a construction loan to pay that at like 8%, 14% interest rate. So you're basically paying for a bathroom twice the price only on the construction material, and you're paying an interest on your financing on top of that. So there's a massive ripple effect on that. So that is also one reason why our cost of construction and town planning and all those things are not taking place. And also investors have a lot of issues when they come and invest, because their construction cost is massive. And that's why countries like China, they come to their own negotiation terms, especially on these construction materials and all that. And also there's a massive labor shortage. That's why what I was told is basically the Chinese labor is 5 times productive than the local labor. And that's why they tend to bring those Chinese labor. Those are all controversial topics. But my point is our productivity and efficiency in this field is very low. And that is because we are not competitive enough. So to bring that competitive aspect, we have to allow the markets to work. And I agree with Vagisha that on the energy sector and all that, there are a lot of opportunities. And in fact, now one of the main controversial themes is Adani is going to, there's a discussion that on the wind power, we are going to give it to Adani on the Mana Basin, the wind power plants, which is about 3 times the current peak time energy demand, I think, which is about 2.4 megawatts. And Adani is going to give about 3 times that with an unsolicited proposal. So I don't think this unsolicited proposal business is going to work. It has to be competitive, because when you only bring that competitive aspect, you can get a reasonable margin. And with the geopolitical tensions, you really can't give it unsolicited proposals, because that will cause a lot of problems. And also it will not reflect the pricing. So it has to move for solicited tender process. But I must also admit there may be very complicated cases. Now, for an example, when you look at the port terminals, on East Container Terminal especially, you have to do the proposals also, like the tender call, in a very long term or like a long thought process. Because if you go for competitive bidding we have to go for competitive bidding for the container terminal. Now Chinese already have CICT, and you have SAGT having another terminal, and the CICT terminal is a deep port, which is about 17 meters depth, where the big ships can be docked. Now, if you and East Container Terminal is also a deep port. Now, if you go for open tenders, of course, the China is going to outbid. They are going to give you a very high price, and if you go for with the normal regulation, the China will going to get that port as well. That will create a lot of geopolitical tensions, and also you create a monopoly of one company for deep water ports in that case. So that's why I think these Japanese and Indians were also interested. So you have to do that proposal in a way that you divide the geopolitical tension. So sometimes it's very tricky, but I'm not endorsing any unsolicited proposals that doesn't reflect the prices, that gives a lot of tax concessions. And in 2010 there was this Strategic Development Act, where the minister has the authority to give tax concessions for your selected investors. And as a result, of a BOI companies reduced from 1,100 to about 800, because, if I'm the minister, Upuli comes with an investor, I can offer, give a tax concession and give the project to them. And these are not very competitive investors. Any good investor won't check the tax concession, because they are paying a tax after they make a profit. So tax concession is not coming as a priority, unless if you are bringing a bad investor, because bad investors want tax concessions because they are keeping a margin with that tax saving. Good investors, they don't ask about tax at the first place. They want the basics, like the electricity, uninterrupted electricity, telecommunications, water, basics, land rights, all those things, and ability to repatriate their profits. Those things are basically looking by the investors. So if you are looking at town planning and all with private investors, given the shoestring budgets by the government, we have to build that infrastructure. And with that also, I agree with Vagisha, we should not let this crisis go waste. We should do that framework where the markets will operate and bring that framework so the private investors will come and the economy will take forward. And then later on, the government will have finances with taxes and with the economic plan, with the economic setup where they can fund a lot of the public goods that the private investors may not be interested in investing, and then you can have a better economic model for the betterment of the citizen.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess what you're suggesting is like we should let the kind of competitive markets to come in place and without looking at the expenditure first, and then looking at the needs and the kind of accountability in place as well. And also, I think it's really, it will be vital bringing this economic perspective to developments also. Those are perspectives that the planners can think also in terms of its regulation and what the implications of those are. So we have, we can have one question. I can see a raised hand from Rohan Kure. Yeah, Rohan, I would like to give you a few minutes, not few minutes actually, now we are like having 5 more minutes to end the session. So would you like to quickly put your question forward?
Thank you, Dr. Ukuli, and thanks for Dhananath and Dr. Vagisha. So let me just give you come back to the question very quickly. My first question is, now the clock is ticking. We are looking at the we are in a situation where we are most like coming to a dead end. So my question is, yes, we do understand the role of town planners in immediate response to this crisis. The current financial and economic crisis is very thin. But when it comes to a long term, short, medium, and long term, there is a role to play by the town planners. So my question goes to Dr. Vagisha. I do understand that the UNDP is suggest to the government on possible debt restructuring instrument, which is the debt for nature swaps in last April, and it was discussed in length in last year also. So I do understand now it's not, of course it's a very complicated process, and it doesn't look billions, it looks in millions, and but I still see there is a silver line in this dark cloud, because we have a national fiscal plan which is developed by the town planners. Of course, the Institute of Town Planners have engaged heavily on this document, and the professionals in various development agencies in the country. So my question is, of course, now this national fiscal plan, which is a document, and it has certain guiding principles: environment conservation, popular economic growth, spatial economic growth in different regions, etc. So I do believe, because that's the only area that I can see when it comes to debt restructuring, can't the UNDP or any IFI which you can get into a discussion, can't the UNDP broker the any agency to come out to tie this national fiscal plan into implementation when the debt for nature swaps discussion start? That's my question, Dr. Vagisha. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rohan, for that question. Duly noted. I also must add a little bit to what you're saying about the National Fiscal Plan. I feel that in the discussions about debt for nature swaps or any kind of innovative financing, the National Fiscal Plan, surprisingly and quite shockingly, if I may add that, doesn't surface. So what you're raising is a very important question, because our planning seems to be a little disjointed. We have a national plan, but the National Fiscal Plan and the national plan don't quite speak to each other, or they're not presented together. So what you have actually asked about, like the using the National Fiscal Plan in consultations or any type of intermediary brokering for debt for nature swaps or anything like that, to use that. So far, to my knowledge, it hasn't surfaced, but what you're raising is a very important point. And I will make sure that I'll raise this with UNDP as well as other IFIs, since we're all working together on this, on these options. And if that is the case, if the National Physical Plan is going to be used for these purposes, can you give some examples of what it can offer, so that I can sort of then, or we can have this conversation separately, bilaterally or with the association itself. How can the National Physical Plan then feed to the debt restructuring ideas? That would be my my request to you, since you've raised this very important question.
Thank you, Vagisha.
Yeah, thank
It's
you.
very interesting, because why I'm saying I'm currently working for Asian Development Bank as a disaster recovery expert for Sri Lanka and other parts of it. So my question, because that we need to understand our role as a town planner. Of course, I'm fortunately, unfortunately, I'm a town planner also, but I'm an economist too. So my question is that now I'm very happy to engage, because I remember Dulani is engaging in discussions, and Hannah also working. So I think I will take this opportunity. Our chairman, or Madam Devasriyani Jayasundar, is our president of the town plan. I think she will take a note on this and take this discussion forward, because
Yes.
we should not stop at this level. Of course, this is just a CPD for the entire membership, but still we need to use this platform to ignite a discussion. I think, thank you very much, Dr. Vagisha, and I hope to see
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much, Rohan. I think we actually, what I can suggest is the ITPSL has already taken certain preliminary steps. I mean, they initiated this effort to bridge this National Physical Plan and the National Plan. So certain conceptual level documentation is also submitted. So I think we can take this platform, and as Rohan suggested, we can take forward this discussion. I can remember even the president had made you certain ideas on that once we were planning the webinar. At the very initial stage also, this matter was raised. So thank you, Rohan, for bringing that up at this webinar as well. I think certainly we can take that point forward in a separate kind of a discussion and see how things can be bridged with certain different forms of enterprising between different agencies. So thank you for that. And of course, the time is up, but because there is so many questions, let me take only one question. I think there are two questions. Let me couple these together. This is actually asking about this political economic issue that you have been raised. So if this is the question in nutshell is asking how to handle this, because we all know that there is a political economic kind of a barrier there in project implementations. So what do you suggest, what do you reckon in fixing this? I mean, it'll be a very difficult question to answer, but because anyway, we have to tackle this. Any quick thoughts on this?
To my knowledge, there are no quick thoughts on this, because what you're asking, what this question is really the question, I think, of the century, not just for Sri Lanka, for any country. I just put this slide up. This is something I made when we were having we are still having the shortage of fuel. You can see all these pillars, right? And see the pillar with the red arrow, the CEB, sorry. The CEB, the corruption and the mismanagement. So the political economy part that I'm getting at is that, right? When it comes to our energy, renewable energy discussions. So this institutional mafias of diesel, coal, mini hydro, whatever. We all know that these people, these are also our people. This is our society, right? We are not talking about the state anymore. When we talk about political economy, it's the state and society, right? So what I'm trying to say with this slide is that the society is as complicit in this crisis as the state is, right? But our answer so far, or our complaint so far, seems to be that one party is bad and evil and we are not. But this slide clearly shows that we are also part of the problem, right? Whether it is us incessant consumerism, whether it is that we are asking for jobs, transfers, all kinds of benefits from the politicians going behind them, whether it is that we are involved in these mafias and cartels that is preventing renewable energy, right? The society is as complicit in this crisis as the state is. So I don't have a quick answer to this, Supuli, and whoever asked this question, I think it's the question. I think that this has to also, I mean, this is not an economics, so there's no economic solution for this, right? There are, of course, legal remedial measures that we can take to prevent corruption and things like that. But in the end, I think we need to practice a fair amount of self-reflection, because this is the most serious question. Self-reflection, and see how we can stop contributing to the problem, whether it is through consumerism, participating in these political economies, and just to see which side we are on, right? I can only give you that very superficial answer, because I don't think we can tackle this question in this
superficially as well. Yeah. So I think Dhananath is also raising hand. Would you like to add anything?
Yes, Upuli, since Vagisha mentioned the Petroleum Corporation and some of the state institutes, I'm quickly going to share my working document, just to explain what's the implication on the debt restructuring on the matter. So what you see is the public guaranteed debt for the state institute. So if I highlight this, you will be able to see, like, the first column is the debt, public guaranteed debt for Ceylon Electricity Board, which is 89 billion. Petroleum Corporation, 561 billion in 2021 itself, right? So the problem with the debt restructuring is, when the state has guaranteed this debt, this will also come on the restructuring table. So I'm not going to scare anyone, but the reality is that, because when the government debt, the public guaranteed debt for the state enterprises will come in the restructuring table. So overall, for these, Sri Lanka coal company here, and National Water Supply and Drainage Board, which is about 200 billion, Road Development Authority 349 billion. So our overall debt in 2021 is about a staggering 1.5 trillion. 1.5 trillion. So this debt restructuring is quite, there's a challenging aspect there. And just to give you a perspective, our Samurdhi allocation is 50 billion. To take care of our poorest people in the society. Of course, it's somewhat, there are political aspects, and we are talking about 50 billion versus 561 billion of public debt only on Petroleum Corporation. But I understand Petroleum Corporation sells also at a loss. They haven't priced it right. But I just wanted to bring that perspective, since Vagisha mentioned, mainly when you don't have competitions, when the markets doesn't work, these challenges cannot avoid. So we have to have that framework. I'll stop from there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I saw a plan was raising hand. So I don't feel right if I didn't give him a plan. Ishara, are you there? Because he had raised his hand for a long time. Right, if he's not there, so let me then say thank you very much for this session. And even though we have a lot of questions and comments, we have to end the session because the time is up. So I would like to hand over this session now to Planner Madhuka for the concluding remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Upali. Well, good morning to all again. Well, it's nearly the noon now. Anyway, let me add thank you remarks to this successful webinar on behalf of the organizing committee, the Center for Urban and Regional Planning of the ITPSL. And I'm apologizing for not having my video. I'm Madhuka Tamarasi, convener to the Center for Urban and Regional Planning. First, I would like to express my gratitude to our guest speakers, Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara and Dhananath Fernando, especially for your time and valuable thoughts shared among professionals in the planning industry. End of the day, it was a really constructive session with valuable insights on economic recovery efforts for Sri Lanka, especially in this crisis period. Also, I would like to thank all the participants, professionals to this webinar. Your desire to knowledge makes this event active and successful by achieving the aim of the CPT event. Further, I add my sincere gratitude to Madam President of the ITPSL, Planet Devshriyani Jayasundara, for your immense support and guidance for a discussion of timely needed topic, and Honorary Secretary and the Council members of the ITPSL for your advice and guidance on the first CPT of the tenure. Here we must appreciate the support by Mr. Rohan Kure for getting us contacted with UNDP Sri Lanka, which enables us to get Dr. Vagisha on board for this webinar. Last but not least, I should remind my organizing committee members, along with Dr. Upuli, Director, Center for Urban and Regional Planning, and Planner Satya, Planner Kaushalya, and Mrs. Yashoda for their dedication towards the event. Thank you. Finally, a small announcement to be made. As you all aware, this webinar has been recognized as a CPD of the ITPSL. So we have shared a feedback link with our last email. You may submit the feedback sheet within a week time as it's a prerequisite to consider the webinar as a CPD event. Again, thank you very much for your presence and active collaboration on the webinar. Wish you a good day.
Thank you.